The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples.
Hi everybody, my name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. Delighted to see you all here today. I want to start by acknowledging that we are here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I want to acknowledge all First Nations people here today and also all elders, past and present. Now today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Denise Thwaites. Denise is a curator, writer and researcher specialising in contemporary cultural economies, who is currently Senior Lecturer in Interdisciplinary Arts here at UC. Denise was awarded her PhD in Aesthetics through the University of New South Wales and l'Université Paris, number 8, before joining UNSW iCinema Research Centre as a postdoctoral fellow. She's worked in the contemporary arts sector at Rosalind Oxley Gallery, Australia Council for the Arts, Museum Contemporary Art Australia, alongside co-curating independent projects for the Institute of Network Cultures in Amsterdam, Art Space Sydney, This Is Not Art Festival Newcastle, New Beginnings Refugee Culture and Arts Festival in Sydney, and Next Wave in Melbourne. And Denise's research has been published in a bevy of publications ranging from Cordite Poetry Review through to Derrida Today. And as you'll see and hear, her work combines a really rare combination of hands-on artistic and curatorial work with really high-level philosophical engagement. So this is going to be a lot of fun.
Thanks everyone for coming. There's a much better turnout than I expected, so thank you. So I thought I should probably start. I'd like to acknowledge that we're here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people. I feel incredibly privileged to be able to continue traditions of cultural transmission, to be thinking about, the meaning of what we do here day in and out, and to pay my respects to all First Nations people who may be with us today, and acknowledge the contributions of elders past, present and emerging. And so I suppose the first disclosure is that for anyone who was hoping there would be science in this presentation, maybe just, it's probably the good moment to leave, because let's just say that the term orbital manoeuvre is perhaps a kind of a loose and incongruous sort of metaphor that I'm using to describe, I guess, my experiences coming out of OSP earlier this year. In the spirit of, heavily qualifying my talk, I'd like everyone to sort of join me in thinking about this as like, as a sort of series of questions and provocations, really. Because it's kind of looking at this image as a way to think about how, not just my experience, but as many people as well find themselves, going for periods of outside study, to think about, what it means to us, what it's worth to us, and how we continue to make it relevant when we come back. So I'll be talking a little bit about that, just some more general thoughts about that orbital manoeuvre, while looking at early outcomes of some of the things I've been doing in France and the Netherlands. And then I'd really like to be able to open the conversation to everyone in the room about, how many different universes and orbits might already exist where we are. To be honest, I don't even know where this image came from. It must have come to me in a dream, like all forms of divine inspiration. But my understanding, at least, is that an orbital manoeuvre is the process of changing the trajectory of a spacecraft from one orbit to another, typically achieved by utilising rocket fuel or rocket engines to adjust the velocity and direction of the spacecraft. And so here's a couple of, funky illustrations about, how these different orbits around different celestial bodies can move. And as, I was exploring this idea, and I just found this term burn manoeuvre, orbital manoeuvre, quite compelling to explore in the first place, and to see how there's, this function for all those different kinds of, satellites or the kinds of bodies that we launch into space. When we get to this close moment, the perigee, how a kind of tactical deployment of force and energy can allow you to shift from one space to another. And it really got me thinking about this idea of, what a burn manoeuvre costs and also what it could be worth. I'm thinking about this in the context of, at least my impression, is like a general impetus to remain on fixed paths of thought that can take us really far, and take us really far really quickly. But then when you're shifting between different ways of thinking, when you're shifting between different ways of making, of knowledge production, of different languages, different cultures, what is, how is that valued? And also, what does it potentially cost people, and how do we think and speak openly about those kinds of processes? And this is kind of drawing on, I suppose, what are these emergent lines of inquiry for me? I have an interest in cultural economies, but something that's really started to sort of develop in my mind is the idea of energy economies. I came across this, the real existence of energy economies via a friend who's an energies trader. And I wasn't aware that there are, real-time dynamic energy markets that require sort of a complementary knowledge of financial markets, but then also engineering about how do we move, natural gas through this pipe at this time, at this point, for this money. And for me, a really interesting anecdote that this trader shared with me is that they know that there is a spike at 7 a.m. of energy demand. And can anyone guess what that spike is caused by? That's right. Everyone getting up to turn on the kettle. Right? And that this cumulative surge of people wanting a cup of tea or wanting a cup of coffee in the morning has this really sort of quantified impact on this, what is in some sense a very abstract market, but also a very sort of concrete system of infrastructures and people evaluating it. So this idea of energy economies I find really sort of interesting and provocative. And I think as well because when we think about how we structure labour and we structure, human resources, quote unquote, we're thinking often about blocks of time. And obviously there are other sort of ways of thinking about, our productivity. One of them being around potentially energy and desire. And obviously energy, some thinking around energy comes into different kinds of disability studies, ways of, there's the sort of the spoon theory. I don't know if anyone's heard about spoon theories, which is a little bit more centered around that idea of how much energy do I have to do a task, rather than how much time do I have to do a task. So this is something that I'm interested in exploring a little bit more, and have been looking, sort of following closely this particular project, Energy, a Philosophy of Practice, which is based out of the University of Dundee. They have a conference coming up that I sadly won't be able to go to because it's in Dundee. But it's sort of premised on this inquiry about the philosophy of energy, because this is something that, harks back to classical Aristotelian ideas around science and what we mean by energy, and obviously has a lot of contemporary resonance around, climate crisis and the way in which the choices we make around energy have really, really significant. And it's an interdisciplinary project. So that's, I guess, where I'm thinking there. But I'm also interested because of energy having this resonance with other kinds of spiritualist traditions. And in the arts, we have a lot of kind of spiritualist artists who have described their work in terms of tapping into energies. In esoteric magic, energy work, or in Reiki, energy work has an active force. The ability to change reality through the channeling of energy is quite interesting to me. And also, I guess, I like to think of myself as a recovering Deleuzian, but I haven't quite given up on the Bergsonian élan vital at this point, which is, I suppose, a kind of fundamentally vitalist understanding of the way in which the continuation of life is, enabled through this vital impulse or impetus that keeps on going. And so how all these ideas of energy in the world can be understood in a really sort of like concrete micro level through things like energy markets, in the ways in which we organise our work, but then also in more kind of spiritualist and ontological ways. So anyway, back to OSP. So I was, during OSP, I was on OSP from February to May. And during that time, I was a professeur invité at Paris 8, and then also spent some time hanging out at the Willem de Kooning Academy and the University of Amsterdam. And then was also a scholar in residence at Photo Access in Canberra. And so here's, for anyone who's not familiar with the University of Paris 8, it has, you know, a reputation and a long history of being aligned with kind of experimental thought and activism. That's little old Denise in 2014 after her thesis defense with her supervisors in front of the Espace Deleuze. A really wonderful moment. And, you know, there's a lot that is still very similar about Parasite, and it's sort of like it's a spirit of being motivated by social justice, radical thought. But there's also a lot of transformation. And it's an interesting orbit to shift back into because there's a lot that is shared, I suppose, between UC and Parasite in terms of its mission, in terms of reducing inequalities and supporting sort of, you know, transformational practices. There are a lot of similarities, I guess, in the demographics between our different student bodies, but there are also fundamental differences around, you know, the cost of higher education. Right? So there are things that you know, and again, would be happy to elaborate if anyone's curious on how those dynamics mean that their pedagogical approaches are in some ways similar, but have got certain affordances that I suppose we don't. But yes, so here's some photos of us and the wonderful research of the TMED team, which was a research lab that I was a part of while I was there. So I suppose the main sort of host while I was there and my main contact was Manuela de Barros, who is a, you know, who I've known for a long time and who, I'll just, you know, simply read it, is an assistant professor in philosophy, aesthetics and theory of arts at University of Paris 8, Vincent Saint-Denis. Her research concerns the aesthetics of contemporary art, new media, relationships between arts, sciences and technologies, biological, anthropological and environmental modifications brought by technosciences, the passages between sciences and fictional constructions in art or literature, feminism and gender, and she's the author of several publications, including Magic and Technology. So when I approached Manuela about us, you know, about coming to Paris and what we might collaborate on, I was really excited to hear that her current research is really is examining space exploration and how space exploration invites us to rethink our concept of life, what we consider to be alive, what life looks like. And so she and Once had this sort of like a research trajectory that way, towards the skies. And in my case, you know, I had been sort of interested in the way in which different kinds of cultural economies have this kind of resonance with ecological systems thinking as well, mycelium networks, root networks. And so what we figured would be a good way to bring those two different trajectories together is through this project, Corps Céleste et Terrestre, which is celestial bodies, terrestrial beings. This was a bilingual program that we curated, an artistic colloquium, at the Centre for Wallonia in Brussels. So it was basically the cultural centre supported by the Belgian and Wallonian, I guess, funding body, yeah. But a brilliant space that has a really experimental program called the Nova XX Biennale. So we were invited to present this artistic colloquium as a part of their program, which has, you know, is inspired by this idea of epistemological disobedience. And so what we were interested in doing was thinking about how we can bring artists and theorists together to talk about, you know, this sort of cross path of trajectories between heading to the skies and also down into the deep soils of mycelium networks. So this was, you know, our co-authored opening presentation. Forgive me if I just read it for a moment. And you can see Donna Haraway obviously photobombing us. So scenes of heaven and earth pulsate with symbolic meanings transmitted not only through culture, but through direct encounters with their living ecological systems. A conceptual journey from the skies to the soil and the soil to the skies allows us to reflect on the ways capitalist and colonial parameters dominate our current imaginary and how we might escape them. The program, Celestial Bodies, Terrestrial Beings, was conceived through a chaosmos of impenetrable structures and ethereal powers that plunge us into a state of confusion, while also offering us new plastic horizons of experience and understanding. In this context, how can we work together, artists, theorists, designers, writers, scientists, to catalyze political and spatial imaginaries to create future places and communities that we want? How might we also free ourselves from trajectories determined by capitalist colonialism and patriarchy? So we didn't touch on much, as you can tell, through that particular symposium, but I suppose what we're interested in is, more broadly speaking, the spatial imaginary, and how the spatial imaginary is responsive to the emergence of different technologies, different kinds of ways in which we narrate space and we understand it. So we had participants who were coming, who were artists, curators, theorists. For example, so up the top here, we had Baden Pelthorpe. He presented on his research working with biometric data harvested through sort of like sports surveillance technologies, where elite sports people are tracked during their training and their performance. And so a data practice that's looking at how, you know, these very embodied experiences and moving down the earth are sort of echoed by these movements of satellites. Annick Bourreau, who is on the forefront of looking at space exploration and the way in which the sort of advancing technologies in that arena is transforming our sense of what is living, ecological systems, and also what is potentially inhabitable. We also had contributions of Amélie Bouvier, and her research is looking specifically at these historical Pickering's harem, who were a group of female scientists who worked in Pickering's lab to be able to sort of like develop more knowledge about, you know, the celestial realm, however, are often sort of englobed in this sense of the harem, and so sort of unearthing these stories of the women behind them and representing them through various sort of graphic and paper-based and such as etching and drawing mainly. There's Louise Charlier, who has a practice which is at the moment looking at this sort of speculative agency, imagining what it could be like to sort of try and sell the image of living elsewhere. Elise Morin, which is down the bottom there, her work she has a varied practice, but she was talking about projects that are looking at the impact of, nuclear testing, nuclear research on various sites. So she's done residencies at the site of Trinity in the United States. And here, the specific example, looking at how the ecological systems near Chernobyl have sort of emerged and re-emerged in resistance to those events. Vidya Kelly Yunkankalu, she had a really interesting project that she shared with us, which was basically looking at, it was called #Sun. And she spoke about how in a place like Paris, when people are living in very dense population, sort of like densely populated and sort of closed in spaces, there is a sort of desire for the sun. And so she looked at how on social media people were using #sun to be able to find patches of sunshine and mapping the trajectories of people across the city looking for the sun. And so that piece there that's displayed is sort of a rendering of those kinds of pathways in a series. And then Natasha Ducouvet, she is the director of Siena Biennale, which is a sort of community-based project in outside Paris, where they think about how they can commune with their specific, the various demographic groups of their surrounds, but also with the sort of natural surrounds, which are on these kinds of urban fringes, and what are the depths of relation that can be known. And then I have Inter Glurick, who is an ethnographer of blockchain cultures. And she was looking at the way in which the kind of volatility of cryptocurrency markets have been kind of strangely codified or overlaid with these phenomena like crypto astrology, trying to get a sense of the formalism of those technological systems mirroring a celestial order that is everlasting and reliable and permanent. And then finally we had Anya Molenda, who is an architectural theorist and critic, and she was talking about worlding beyond dimensions and the way in which Euclidean space governs our perceptions of what is possible in terms of urban design and how we live together. but inviting us to think about how, for example, monsoon methods of imagining space as a kind of resistant form could also imagine new ways of living together. So I suppose what the outcome was of this big sort of like broad topic, where we were also working across two languages. So half our presentations were given in French, the majority were given in French, and then we had 3 that were given in English. But we had these other conversational panels at the end between artists where people were welcome to be able to sort of move between the two. So people are able to speak in their native tongue, knowing that they can be understood by someone else in the and they can respond in their native tongue. And what was just really striking to me was the way in which there's so much about this program that could not have been achieved if there was a singular sort of imposition of one language. That not only because of the sort of the space for people to be able to express themselves in their native tongue, but also the vulnerability that comes with asking people to express themselves in their non-native tongue. I wanted to sort of, share this today because I do know that there are lots of researchers in this centre, in our HDR cohort, who precisely know this experience of moving between languages. Will have different kinds of understandings of the affordances of being able to move in between a native tongue, a second tongue, a third, a fourth, a fifth. And whether there is scope for us to think about the value of those kinds of manoeuvres, the work that is involved in that, but also what that can offer us in terms of, exposing us to new horizons of thought, of imagery. So yeah, what kinds of distinctive conversations can emerge or be facilitated through a bilingual program, and how do we value these labours of connection? Because what was really touching, I suppose, about this particular experience was the sense of a desire to connect. That when you have these hurdles and people are obviously working to be able to communicate despite those barriers, you have this palpable sense of the lengths or the energy that people are willing to expend to be there. And so that was just, an interesting thought for me in the context of thinking about, how does that enable a different kind of encounter? And precisely new orbits of thought. So what came more specifically for me, and that I suppose I'm still in the process of reflecting on, is as I was being able to, I was having to think about how I would present my own work and my own kind of professional and scholarly and creative practice, I was conscious of the way in which the word, curator is evolving in the French language. People would often say commissaire d'exposition, but that's a very exhibition-based way of understanding what a curator is and a connoisseur. But sort of curatrice is a word that you see more now. And it's interesting because, it has etymologically the same link as curator, but something about the sound of that word in French just made the connection between a kind of curative and a curator really palpable to me in a way I hadn't heard it before. And so it got me thinking about the way in which a curative, something that seemed to be medicinal, is something that can enter into a system and change its course. And I think we often think about curatorial practice in that relational sense. And the cure can be the poison, as we all know, things can go either way. But what does that mean to play that role? To see yourself as something that can be an infiltrating force, and in that sense, what responsibilities do we hold in that role? But also the way in which people will describe, for example, what we call an artist-run space in Australia. There are lots of artist-run spaces, not so much in Canberra, but they're plenty across the country. We might talk about like community-based practice, community-based arts. But the word that I saw people going to in France was associative. And there is a term in French we talk about like la vie associative, associative life, to encompass community life, to encompass cooperative practices. The term collaboration is used, but I have had people tell me that there can be a hesitance, particularly amongst a certain generation, because of the connotations of the collaboration with the Nazi regime in France. So associative is an interesting alternative. And for me, because the term associative I had previously been using in relation to my writing practice. We think about free, open association, and we think of people like Virginia Woolf or Joyce or André Breton as people who are engaging in a kind of practice where they're sort of their way of making is about an openness and an ability to associate things that may not have a rational connection to them, but have a kind of either subconscious or intuitive relation. And so this is, again, this is the kind of way I work in general, in a curatorial sense. So, because I guess that's it as well. When you're doing community-based work, I think one of the big things we often think about social practice as being very process-oriented, because we know how to talk about the process. We can make process sound controlled. We can make process sound scientific and systematic. But ultimately, what comes through in the making is something that's built collectively. And it's something that I think is interesting to consider, not in terms of necessarily intentional collaboration, but how different unpredictable associations for each party in a collaborative process of making brings forth something that could not have been predetermined, is about a sort of radical openness to others that is not necessarily captured by the idea of collaboration, which has more of a purposeful, strategic end to it. So yeah, this is my question. If the right to free association is essential to community life, how might a curatorial practice also be nourished by the right to freely associate forms and concepts that are otherwise divided along disciplinary, social, or economic lines? So then Orbital manoeuvred to the Netherlands, and this is shorter. So this was had a grand old time here. I was in Rotterdam for a part of it, and then I was in Amsterdam. In the second image you can see there is at the Willem de Kooning Academy. And I was really interested in visiting the Willem de Kooning Academy because they have a very interdisciplinary program. And what really struck me about their program when I went and I learnt about it was that the way in which their building is structured is that it requires people to walk through each other's studios to be able to get to where they want to go. And so it's a kind of long route, right? But it's one that means that you're always having to be, or you become somewhat aware of these other orbits that are around you, the making that is happening, the different languages of creation. And so it was another context where I was thinking about how a lot of people might groan about not having the most direct route, but how a purposeful organisation of studios, of offices can actually impact your ability to create together and to teach together, because all of their subjects are co-taught. And then something else that I suppose really struck me about the exhibitions that I saw in the Netherlands and generally also my experience in the city is the way in which there is this really interesting crafting of networks. So flows of people through the city. Now, I don't know if anyone else has been to this tunnel in Rotterdam, but there is an underground layer which is for pedestrians, and over the top there is the cyclists' lane. So you have these sort of like two registers of people meandering underneath the great port of Rotterdam, these massively, in terms of global economy, a significant place. These two registers of catering for different flows and spaces of people trying to move across the city. And camera bewaking, I first looked at that and I was like, oh my God, what an interesting combination of words. It just means CCTV. But again, I thought it was, an interesting way in which they can associatively, it's what leapt out at me there as well. Because some of you may be aware that, again, in the Netherlands, there is this kind of celebration, or there's a reputation for this really vibrant alternative publishing space, experimental publishing practice as well. I was delighted to be able to visit Varia, which is, a community-based organisation. They run their own server. They hold workshops, and they also have, publish different kinds of formats of work. But they have, a very clear, progressive agenda and community-oriented agenda. And what was really interesting as well that I learned there is that they've effectively operated as a kind of shadow curricula to other kind of major institutions. So where there have been students who have been interested and inspired to be able to, extend their thinking around a particular topic or to be able to push themselves, these kinds of spaces become this avenue to channel that energy, to challenge that curiosity and desire, which made me think actually quite a bit about, I don't know if many people here know the story of photo access in Canberra, but it was likewise initiated by scholars from the ANU School of Art a long time ago. It had very explicit kind of cooperative aims to be able to foster actually skills for employment for people, that there was funded by these kinds of programs to teach people how to take photographs. But it also had a really fundamental role in being able to enable photo documentation of different kinds of protests, different kinds of activism throughout the city. And it is still, a member-based organisation, and I think the country's only publicly accessible darkroom. As an outcome of all this thinking, we've been doing some sort of co-teaching with them this semester and doing special projects precisely around experimental publishing to see how we can also think about our relationships with these non-sort of academic institutions as being a kind of exchange and circulation of energies, questions, and certainly for our students, potential horizons that they can explore after their studies here. And then the final image here is the Feminist Finance zine, which was published by Amateur Cities, which is a brilliant publications platform, and this was co-edited by Anya Molenda, Intergloric, and Christina Pizarro. And this was actually if you can believe it, a conference proceeding style thing. So this was an outcome of the Money Lab conference back in 2020. But rather than thinking about a conference as a kind of closed scene and a closed network, and a proceedings being the evidence of what happened in that space through abstracts and whatnot, what they facilitated through this was continuing conversations. They came back to different presenters and asked them to expand upon different ideas. There was purposeful design to put different kinds of ideas into conversation, or people who had not been able to present, to put them in dialogue with other people who'd been there. And so beyond creating this zine, which was then distributed, they also created a freely available syllabus, which was sort of like developing once more and things that were shared in that sort of more closed environment to sort of like think about those energies as not sort of like being contained and suppressed in one place, but contributing to an ongoing kind of ecosystem of thought and action. I'm really thrilled that we'll be collaborating with Amateur Cities as well to think about how we can develop something like this as an outcome of celestial bodies, terrestrial beings. To think about the energies that we expend in going to places like this and sharing our ideas, the vulnerabilities that we sort of accept in being able to share work and have that potentially, critiqued by others. How do we take that energy and continue a conversation? How do we not let that be something that is forgotten, but something that continues to create and continues to transform? Because something that really, struck me as well when I was in the Netherlands is the way in which this sort of maritime empire is discussed by a lot of people in the Netherlands as being, the foundations of their success has been around logistics and shipping and trade. And if you go to Amsterdam Centraal, you will see that they have a clock tower on one side and a wind dial on the other. It speaks to the fact that obviously for a maritime empire, these were the massive determinants for when to sail. How much light do I have left? What's the direction of the wind? It speaks to, I guess, the way in which the harnessing of that energy has been, has underpinned their ability to sort of disseminate ideas, to colonize, diverse corners of, distant corners of the earth. And at the Willem de Kooning Academy, led by Skye Moore O'Brien, there's this fascinating project which is precisely looking at that. Breath and Breeze, Tongueless Whispers of the Wind is a research creation project that looks at the wind technology in the Dutch colonial footprint in Barbados and other Caribbean islands that are still connected to the Netherlands. The Dutch played an extensive role in shaping colonial rule, slavery, trade, labour, and the plantation economies through the use of wind technology. For example, at one time Barbados had more than 500 windmills, more than any other country besides the Netherlands. The skeletal remains of these windmills are part of the visual landscape of the island, reminding us of something that is supposed to be long over and done with, but which lingers unresolved. The research investigates what it means to trace the politicisation of wind figuratively, creatively, deliberately. The purpose is to explore reparative justice and how past colonial structures and the systems of power that built them continue to haunt the present. So again, this is, drawing me back to that idea of how harnessing of energy, and, this is something obviously that we're familiar with in Australia as well. The politics of who gets to decide what kind of energy we use, how those kind of global powers are made and destabilized through that control of energy flows. And we can think of that in terms of, fossil fuels, pipelines, technological IP, but then also just labour, the way who has the power to be able to determine what kind of labour is valuable. Then on a micro level, how could recirculating energy flows allow us to disrupt fixed orbits of thought and action? So I'm not telling everyone to go and siphon petrol from their boss's car, but I mean, that's always, that's up to you. But the idea of reclaiming time, I think, is something that people there is a conversation around reclaiming time. And I don't know, I'm interested to know what people think. If there is a way to think differently around energy, if there's a way to organise ourselves and value one another in terms of energy rather than rather than time, which can be a fairly arbitrary measure. And then also the idea of energy is something that can be created as well as spent. So how do things like desire, curiosity, stimulus, how are they our rocket fuel? And is that what makes the orbital maneuver worth it, right? Because that orbit can take you to places you never would have been otherwise. It'll stimulate you, it'll give you other kinds of energies that you couldn't expend. So how do we think about, again, when we're organising our time or valuing ourselves, how much fuel are we creating at the same time as expending? And how does a burn manoeuvre, crossing languages, cultures, impact energetic trajectories? How can a burn be worth it in systems that prioritise narrow advancement? So yeah, that was these are my provocations from these 3 months. Still, as you can see, very nebulous, but thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks very much, Denise.